Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Zach. This is my home, a Sprinter named Gertie, and I live in there with my dog Winter. We've been doing it for 3 years now, and I want to cover how I do oil changes in it. Currently, I'm actually at a friend's house because I don't actually like dumping a bunch of oil even into the pan out in the woods because there's a potential for polluting the environment out there, and I want to keep it as pristine as possible. So I usually do this in town at like a rest area or an automotive store's parking lot, or in this case, I'm actually at a friend's house. Mercedes recommends that you change the oil every 20,000 miles, which is extremely long-lived. It's so long-lived that most people that you may talk to about changing oil in a diesel engine will say that that's absurd. I originally thought that I'd start doing it every 10,000 miles, but after talking to my friend who is a diesel mechanic and the guy at the auto parts store, checking on some forums, and of course watching some YouTube videos, I've come to the conclusion that every 5,000 miles is probably going to be my best bet for managing the engine and for managing the oil. Because oil, even though technically this fully synthetic oil will break down after about 20,000 miles of use, and that's what the lawyers say and that's what the book says, that's not in actuality. Diesel engines have, specifically turbo diesel engines, which is almost all of them, they have a lot of pressures, which means that there's a lot of blow-by, which means that the exhaust and the soot from the diesel being burned actually gets into the oil, and then that floating around is what really degrades the oil. From my understanding, after talking to a service advisor who had a lot of knowledge, he has 25 years of working with diesels, he stated that the reason it's so long like that, 20,000 miles, is because big companies that use these vehicles, such as Amazon and FedEx, decided that they didn't want to change every 10,000 miles, which was the original recommendation of Mercedes. They wanted to push it out to 20,000 miles, which, as you can imagine, with tens of thousands of vehicles, that saves them a lot of money. But unfortunately, if the consumer follows those service intervals, they may experience some engine failure much sooner than they hope. So that's why I recommend oil being changed every 5,000 miles in these guys. I have a lot of good information from good sources that recommend that kind of service intervals. So that's what I'm trying to stick to. I'm probably at 7,000 miles at full disclosure. So when you see the oil come out absolutely black, you won't smell it, but it smells really bad. And anybody that knows even a little bit about oil will tell you that that's not the kind of oil that you want running around in your engine for another 15, or in my case, 13,000 miles. To start out, oil changes are pretty much the same in every vehicle. You undo the drain plug, let all the oil come out, pull your oil filter if it has one. Smaller engines, such as like generators or two-stroke motorcycles, do not have filters. You just change it a lot more often. But in the van, I have a filter, and that requires a special tool to open it. But other than that, it's pretty cut and dried, super simple process. But there's a few tips I want to share with you that'll make it a lot easier when you go to do it yourself. So let's get started with the tools and materials you need. Behind me, I have 13 quarts of oil. I have 2 big 5-gallon jugs and then 3 of these quarts or liters. They're actually in liters. The van actually takes 13 liters of oil, which is a lot. Most vehicles, you have about as many quarts or as many liters. It depends on if it's a European or an American-made vehicle. You have as many quarts and liters as you do cylinders. So typically, in a 6-cylinder like this, you'd have about 6 quarts to put into it. But when Mercedes designed this engine, they designed it for reliability, for working really hard, so they gave it over twice as many liters as you see standard for oil capacity. So I need 13 of them to refill this thing, and I'm going to be exchanging the filter as well. I always recommend that people change the filter at every oil change because that just ensures that the oil is as clean as possible and that's going to make your engine last as long as possible. Oil is really cheap insurance to make sure that your vehicle lasts as long as it can. Lack of oil or really bad oil is one of the leading causes of engines self-destructing, because that's what prevents all the metal pieces in the engine that are rubbing against each other from wearing each other out. So along with oil, I have a filter. I ordered this kit from a company called Blauparts. And they send a full kit. I just say what vehicle I have. They send me the oil filter, all the oil I need, and then this little washer here, which is the crush washer. The crush washer goes between the oil drain plug screw and the block, and that just allows you to not have to tighten it down so much. You can tell that it's a copper colored filter there, or excuse me, it's a copper colored washer. And copper is a softer metal than the steel of the bolt and the steel of the block. The one special unique tool that you will need is going to be an oil filter wrench, and this is actually an oil filter cap wrench. The Sprinter requires that you have an 84 millimeter round one with 14 flutes on it, which is just the flat spots that go around it. I was unable to find an 84-14, so I picked up this adjustable one, which does a range, I think it's like 79 to 90 something. We've covered the service interval, the parts that you're going to need, and the special tools that you're going to need. I'm going to talk about the normal tools that you need. You don't necessarily need a flathead screwdriver, but I have a tip that I'm going to share with you that tells you that a flathead screwdriver like this guy is going to make things a whole lot easier just by removing one extra part. And I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a few minutes. The other tool that you need is a socket wrench. This is a 3/8 inch drive, which is, I wouldn't call it standard, but it's probably the most common drive that you're going to see versus a 1/4 and a 1/2 inch. So 3/8 inch is what fits into the back of my oil wrench, and it's also what fits into a 13 millimeter socket. So you'll also need a 13 millimeter socket, and that's what takes off the oil drain plug. I personally like to have an assortment of extenders. So this is, I don't know what inch, probably a 6-inch extender. Down it goes. And this is about a 2 to 3 inch extender. The main reason I have an extender is probably going to be for the oil filter cap. You don't really need one for the oil drain plug, but it is handy to use an extender down there, like a short one like this guy, because that'll allow you to not have your wrench covered in oil when you pull that thing out. Usually by the time you pull it all the way out, you're just undoing it by hand. You will also want an oil drain pan. This one has a 15 liter capacity, which easily handles the 13 liters that are going to come out of my engine. You also want a funnel. I actually have a second funnel just in case I want to transfer the oil into a new container. I have one for dirty oil, one for clean oil, and then shop towels are another necessity, which allows you to clean up your hands, clean up anywhere you don't want oil, something you can put on the ground to catch extra oil. And these ones are lint free and a lot tougher than regular paper towels, so they're less likely to tear. So that is all the parts, tools, and supplies that you will need to complete this project. So we've covered the parts, we've covered some tips on the service change interval, we've covered the tools, and we've covered the materials. So now it's time to get down to business and start changing the oil in this rig. Now that we're at the front of the van, we can start with the process of doing the oil change. I like to make sure that everything goes really smoothly. The order of operations is you pull out the drain plug, you pull out the filter, you replace the drain plug, you replace the filter, and then you fill it with oil. For me, I like to add an additional step on the Sprinter. Because it's so easy to remove, I like to remove the air box off of the top of the engine. It only takes the use of this flathead screwdriver and then a little bit of finagling it just right. It's very easy. Almost anybody with even a little bit of mechanical knowledge will be able to do what I'm about to do. And it just gives you a lot more room to operate when you're getting the top off of the oil filter container. I like to move the air filter out of the way first, because immediately after I start pulling the drain plug out, while the oil pan is down underneath, I like to pull the filter next so that everything kind of happens at once, and then it gives the oil time to drain out of the bottom of the engine and then the oil time to drain out of the filter, so that I can throw that away in the proper manner, which most of the time is you just bring it to an automotive store and then they're able to get rid of the waste oil and the filter for you. Okay, so here in the engine compartment, this is your air box, and this is going into the turbo, and then this will be your intake. I have a snorkel on my van, so this will look a little bit different. In a standard van, this will go over to right about here, and then that unit you just have to disconnect here, and then you're able to pull the air box out. And then one other thing is this terminal here, this goes to the battery. To pull that off, there's a little tab underneath. You push the tab in, and then that just pops right off the air box, and I just tuck it over there out of the way. So let's take off this guy here. It's actually harder to get off while the airbox is still in there, so I just loosen it so that it'll slide right off. And then there's these two plugs. You want to pinch it and then wiggle it back and forth. I found that if I just take one side, there we go, it comes right off. This one's a little bit easier. Push down the concealed tab there, and then it comes off. And then we have our second screw. This one is pretty easy to pull off. Just give it a wiggle, off it comes. This is your mass airflow sensor that stays in place. Down here, these are two poppers. Firm grip on one of them, it'll allow both of them to pop off, and then the airbox lifts away. Oh. So now the airbox is lifted away. I have it here. I just have to get the intake off of it. Difficult to do one-handed. Pull that off, and here comes our airbox. I just set the airbox on the ground out of the way so that it doesn't get any oil on it, and so I don't step on it. You want to be careful not to get any dirt in that, especially on the engine side of the airbox, which is on the top, because then that'll go straight into the engine as soon as you start it. Let me climb back up. So now you look at now we have access to the top of the engine. Here's our turbo. If you ever have to replace your fuel filter is going to be right there. That's your fuel filter. Check out somebody else's video or mine if I ever make one for pulling that guy out. It's not too difficult, but there's a few tricks you want to do, and that's where the intake goes in. But what we're really worried about is this guy right here. This is the container / housing for your oil filter, and that's what I need this special tool for. So right now I'm going to loosen that up to about hand tight, and then that'll allow me to pull it off when I pull the drain pan out. And this we're going to set underneath the vehicle, so when I open the drain bolt, the oil will go right into here and then into this little plug hole there. So now I'm going to put my oil drain pan under there and pull off the cap that allows it to drain into there. I've built this little box platform here. That way my drain pan is as close to the bottom of the engine as possible. The reason I put it as close to the engine as possible is if the wind comes up, you want the oil to be going directly into it. And as for positioning, right here is my drain plug. You want to put one end of it directly underneath that, or perhaps just a little bit behind it, because sometimes the oil will run back along the oil pan and you want to catch every drop. But when you first undo it, there's actually quite a bit of pressure, so it could shoot all the way out to here. So as soon as you pull that bolt out, you want to make sure and be ready to position it just right so that you catch all the oil as it comes out. Now that I have that positioned under there, I'm going to grab my socket wrench, and I'm going to grab my special oil tool. I have my oil filter tool and my wrench connected. So the oil filter tool goes right over the top. This is a little difficult to do one-handed, but I think we'll manage. All right, it's kind of hard to see, but this adjustable one, you just slide over the top. And then you want to go to the lefty loosen, and loosen that guy up. Okay, so now I have it to less than hand tighten, so I can remove the rest of it just by hand. I'm going to leave that there, and now we're going to go underneath the engine and start loosening up the engine bolt. So now I need my socket wrench for this reason, and I need my 13-inch socket. Okay, so now it's time to start the show. We're going to start getting the oil out of this. I have my drain pan positioned underneath of it, and I have it opened up and ready to receive the oil. Gotta love this angle. So now we're underneath the van, and here is our oil drain plug. Should still be on lefty loosen. Usually pops the first time. Now it's completely loose because you don't want to over tighten them. It should just be a little bit tighter than hand tightened. If you need a number, I would say maybe a quarter turn after it makes good contact with the crush washer. So now I'm just pulling it off by hand, making sure everything's ready for it. There we go. That is some black oil. Look at that, just pitch black. Can't even see my finger even with a light layer. So now I'm going to monitor this for the first little bit to make sure that it's going in. That's why you have to make sure the air is able to get out, because if it can't, it won't drain in fast enough. With 13 liters, if something goes wrong, it makes a really big mess really fast. The drain plug is actually best just to put in the top of that. As long as you don't lose sight of it, it's fine, because it's going to have oil all over it as well. And now we wait. I like to hang out under here to make sure everything's going right at first. The oil just smells like diesel. Diesel soot, anyway. It's going to take a while for this all to get out. I'm going to turn my attention to the oil filter now, so we can turn this into as efficient a process as possible. You definitely don't want the oil pan to not be in the right positioning. As it's kind of dribbling out slower, I'll actually move it a little bit more underneath the block, and that way if it does start to go in a different direction, it's less likely to get on the ground. Coming back up on the engine, this is where we're able to pull this guy all the way off, and so any drippage will fall down into the pan, which conveniently, you can see it all the way down there, is located underneath of this as well. There's the cap, which has the filter attached, and there's where the filter goes. So here's the paper filter here, and we're going to have to pull that off of here, and that will get us a new place to put our oil filter. So the oil filter just pulls right off of there. Thankfully I haven't ran the van for quite a while. Sometimes it's actually a good idea to warm it up and heat it up, but it's been warm enough here that the oil should just come out. It'll just take slightly longer. These things can often be full of oil, but it actually has worked out to my favor that I haven't ran it in a while because I'm waiting on some parts. So everything is relatively clean. I like to use the shop towel to get out as much of the old oil as possible. This thing is practically dry, so that's making my job a lot easier. So that's ready to receive the new filter. Which looks the same both ways. So with the new filter, one of the things you get 2 rubber O-rings. The small O-ring actually just goes right on the tip of the filter housing. I can usually get them off with my fingernails, but you may want to get a separate tool such as a hook or whatever. But since you have replacements, it's actually not a big deal if you damage it. For me, I'm going to use my Swiss Army knife, which has this leather awl on it, which is for putting holes in leather, but it also works pretty good for getting really small O-rings off as well. There we go. Pull a little O-ring off, and then the larger O-ring you see in there actually goes around this entire housing here. This one's a little bigger, but I'm still going to use my tool. So I use that, get it underneath, and that allows me to slide it up and off. Now usually there are other types of filters that have a seal and everything is all one unit, but since this one is just the paper filter, I just have these guys. And what they recommend with those, the proper way to do it, as they say, is to put some fresh oil on it before installing it. So you just want to dab your finger inside the oil container once you get through all the layers of protection. So you want to dab your finger in there, get some fresh clean oil on there, and once you get that fresh oil, you just pop it up over, nice and easy. Boom, that's done. I still got fresh oil on this finger, so I'm just going to run it around the edge of this guy, clean off its home from the dirty oil again, just to make sure I got it all. And then this guy will slide over the top of that. You want to be gentle because you don't want to put any unnecessary holes. And there's a spot like in the middle of the second and third threads that it goes. It's important to put it there because there's actually holes in there that potentially transfer oil through there. So now that I've replaced the seals, or the O-rings, just take my filter, make sure there's nothing that says this way, out. Oh no. There we go. Takes a little bit of force to get it on there, and then you push it all the way down. Okay, they're the right filter, it just fits tighter than the one I had. There. So now everything should look like that. We have a new large O-ring, we have a new small O-ring, and then we have a fresh filter in there which has a little bit of old oil on it, but that won't hurt anything. It's going to be that way eventually anyways. So this, a lot of times I find it's best just to sacrifice a Ziploc bag and put it in there, because otherwise you may end up with black oil all over everything. Now that my filter assembly is all assembled just right, I'm going to go clean out where I'm going to put that to make sure that there's no old oil in there, because I like to get as much as possible. As much of that old oil as you can get out of the system, the better. Thankfully this guy is quite clean since it hasn't ran for a few days, and so there's not much for me to get out. Makes my life a little bit quicker, theoretically. So I'm just wiping that out nice and clean. Still some oil in there. Get my hands nice and manly. If you do this every day in a shop, you definitely want to protect your hands, because there's a lot of solvents in this oil that could cause some irritation. All right. So my filter assembly is all ready to go. Now I can reinstall the filter. I recommend you just put it in there as tight as your hands can do it and not use the wrench at all. When it comes down to it, if you just happen to have oil leaking out of there because it's not tight enough, all you have to do is tighten it a little bit. And if you do it by hand, there's no chance of getting it too tight. Since I'm putting plastic into metal threads, I don't want to put it too tight, because if I put it too tight, then I can strip out those threads. The wrench is actually not designed to tighten it anyways. I did put it on there to see if I could get it a little bit tighter, but now it's as tight as I can put it on there by hand, so that should be sealed enough to not cause any issues. It does have a torque value, which is 25 Newton meters. Now that I have my fresh filter in there, I'm going to check and see if the oil's still draining out of the bottom. It's a very small stream of oil coming out. To make sure that I get all of the oil, I'm actually going to pull the oil cap off, just in case for some odd reason there's a pressure holding the oil in. I'm going to let that drain out. So I'm going to let the rest of that oil drain out, and once it's done, I'll pick you back up. As the oil is draining, I went and I grabbed a funnel because I forgot to grab one of those before. Funnel is also super important. It makes it a lot easier anyway. You can put oil in without a funnel, but with one, it just makes it a lot less likely that you're going to miss and get some on the engine, which is just going to cause unnecessary smoke when everything is running. And attached to my box, I had my crush washer. So before I put any oil in, the most important thing to do is you have to put that drain plug back in. I forgot to put the drain plug back in, and I've wasted oil doing that. So remember to grab your crush washer and put it on the drain plug or the oil pan plug bolt, and then just tighten it down to the recommended tightness. A good rule of thumb is tighten it all the way hand tightened, and then do about a quarter turn to tighten it the rest of the way. Again, if it leaks, it's very easy to just tighten it down the rest of the way to stop that leakage. It's a lot harder to fix stripped threads than it is to just tighten it down. So I'm officially done with this box, and I'll just dispose of that in the trash, and I'm going to place my funnel and then remember to put the drain plug back in. Funnel just goes right there. Now there's just a little bit of a drip coming out. I can definitely let that sit there and finish dripping, but it's not absolutely necessary. So I like to clean off the bolt so that it's nice and clean. Putting it back in there doesn't have dirty oil, as much dirty oil in the threads. My drip has slowed down quite a bit, just a few times a minute, so I like to wipe around everything here, get it as clean as possible. I have my crush washer, my fresh crush washer on there. And I just start threading it in by hand. Make sure you have righty-tighty, lefty-loosen figured out. Since I'm behind it, I'm actually going the opposite direction to what I would expect. It should be very easy to do by hand. That's fully connected and almost completely sealed. So now this is when I take out my wrench, my socket wrench, make sure and flip the little switch so it goes the right direction, and give it about a quarter turn to tighten it all the way down. I don't even think it's about a quarter turn. There. So it's about 1/8 of a turn to tighten it all the way down, I'd say. So I did about 1/8 of a turn, and that'll stop any oil from coming out when I start filling it from the top. So now we get to start the lovely oil filling process. This means everything's pretty much done. I just need to put fresh blood in the van. While I was waiting for all the oil to drain out, I prepared all of my oil by pulling off the seals and preparing, like these big ones have kind of a little pour spout. So now we're just going to pour the oil in, and that'll be it. The big ones, you pour them from this direction, When I start pouring, I like to make sure there's none coming out of the bottom. If you put the drain pan on there or the drain plug on there, you shouldn't have to worry about that, but I like to manually check because if I manually check just in case I don't do what I'm sure I did, then we're all good to go because I visually verified that. You don't necessarily have to do that, but it doesn't hurt. Good to make sure all the oil gets out, because if it doesn't, then you're not measuring it completely right, but also don't worry about it if you don't get all of it. It is definitely not the end of the world. But this stuff costs quite a bit of money, so it's good to make sure you use every last drop. So it's just repeat until all the oil is poured back into the van. That is 5 liters down. Notice how this oil is quite clear and just kind of has an amber tone to it, as opposed to the pure black that came out of the engine after 7,000 miles. It's important to shift the container around a little bit to see if there's any kind of hiding in some of the curves. You obviously design them to come out as best they can, but this one has a big handle, which is probably where that extra oil was stored. All right, so now we're just down to the 3 small ones. I've already pulled off the seal out of all these. Now, when we're talking about pouring out of these liter or quart bottles, you would think that you pour like this, but the way they're designed, you can see there's actually a handheld on this one, is to be poured like this. That stops it from making the glunk, which will make your oil go all over the place sometimes. And you notice how it pours out of there nice and smooth. Spilled a drop. A lot of times, if it'll behave, I'll just let it sit there while I grab the other one. Now I have poured 12 of the 13 liters into the engine. I like to hold off on the last one, mainly because this guy doesn't actually come with a dipstick. You can buy them from Mercedes, but they don't come with them. Perhaps higher tier models will have them, but mine doesn't. So I usually hold on to the 13th one. I see what my oil level's at, and then if I need more oil, I'll add it in there. Because even though I'm doing the draining process properly, there still might be oil stored around in the engine compartment or in the engine block. And so I want to make sure that I don't put too much in, because if you put too much oil in, that will overpressurize the engine casing and you could potentially blow out seals. I've done it in the past, and if you blow out a seal, it's a lot worse than running 1 liter. So it's a lot worse to put too much oil in than it is to put too little oil in. So I can wait and add this at a later date. So I'm going to hold on to this until I run the engine and have a chance to check the proper level. So the next step that I want to do is I want to pull out the funnel, make sure and put the ends on. Oh my God. So I just got done pouring. Oh shit. Well, I completely forgot to hit record on pouring all of the oil, but it's not the end of the world because that's probably the most boring part of this. I just covered the proper ways to pour oil. If you're pouring out of one of these containers, you want to pour this way so that the big part is down, and that prevents it from going all over the place. All right, so once all the oil is put in there, you just want to replace the cap. Check for any loose tools in and around the engine, because you don't want to start the engine with anything where it's not supposed to be. So here's my funnel and my shop towels. All right, so now that we have put all the fresh oil in there and made sure that the plug is done and put the cap back on, removed all the tools, the final step is just to replace the airbox. So now I'm going to get that done. The airbox just goes back in reverse order that it was in. I put it generally in position, slide the intake on. Once the intake's on, I reposition the airbox on the little mounts in the rear. And those just shove on, and then the front ones just pop back in. Then the outlet to the turbo slides on. Grab my screws, screw them back on tight so that I don't have any air leaks. Pop back the battery terminal onto its mount and plug in the electronic sensor plugs. If you don't put those on, you'll end up with an engine code. And tighten the airbox outlet to the turbo. Nice and snug. You don't need to torque these down at all. Just snug will do it. They're designed to seal at snug. Remove all of the tools and the camera, and we are done. All right, so with my camera battery quickly coming to an end, we have finished changing the oil. Hopefully that was clear enough to give you the confidence to do it on your own. And if you already know how to change oil in vehicles, hopefully you got some information about the Sprinter in specific that will help you do it a little bit more efficiently first time around, rather than trying to figure it out for yourself. Since my camera battery is about to die, I'm completely out of things to say, now's the perfect time for me to request that if you got something out of this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you want to stick around for the information that I have next, or you just want to go on my next adventure, please hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so that you know as soon as I post a new video. I really appreciate you tuning in and watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day.